לא,
או
אצלנו
שזה
בסדר,
אצלי?
אנחנו רואים בסדר.
זה זה- זה בסדר. שהוא אצלי הוא כפוף. סטיבן? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Okay, good to see you.
You too. Is the audio still all right?
אז ערב טוב. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And I look fabulous?
Yeah, look great as usual. ערב טוב לכולם. אנחנו שמחים לעוד מפגש בימים המאתגרים האלה. אנחנו מארחים שוב את סטיבן ג'נקינסון, שהסכים לעשות לנו עוד שיחה. אנחנו שותפים למסע, ואנחנו מנסים בתקופה המאוד מורכבת הזאת לקיים מפגשים עם אנשים שיכולים לתת לנו השראה. נדמה לי שאחד הדברים שהכי משותפים לכולנו זה שאנחנו מאוד מבולבלים. הרבה דברים קרסו לנו, תפיסות, השקפות, דרך. ואנחנו מחפשים את ההשראה הזאת מכל מיני אנשים ומורים שיכולים לתת לנו איזושהי השראה. אז אנחנו מקיימים סדרה של מפגשים עם כל מיני מורים, תוכלו למצוא את כולם באתר שלנו, את אלה שכבר היו, וגם את ההקלטה של המפגש הזה תוכלו למצוא באתר, כמו עוד הזמנה להצטרף לקבוצות וקו חירום למי שזקוק לשיחה אישית של אחד על אחד. וזהו, אנחנו כאן בשבילכם לכל מה שאתם צריכים בימים האלה, בימים אחרים, בהתמודדויות עם האתגרים. ואנחנו מאוד שמחים על המפגש הזה הערב, ואני בטוח שהוא יהיה מאוד משמעותי בשביל כולנו. Thank you, Stephen, that you are with us tonight.
You're
On
very
your
welcome.
way from one side of the world to the other side of the world,
Yes.
you stopped and this talk, and so generous. Thank you.
Thank you too.
אני רק אגיד עוד שהמיקרופונים מושתקים ואתם לא יכולים לפתוח אותם כרגע, וגם הצ'אט יכול להיות רק למי שמוגדר כרגע כמארחים, זה בועז וסטיבן ואני ושמי, אז אם יש משהו דחוף אתם יכולים לכתוב לנו, ואם לא אפשר להתאפק עד לזמן שאפשר יהיה לשאול שאלות. So, Stephen, the floor is yours.
I'll just say two things, okay?
Okay.
Okay. So I just wanted to say what Rafi said in Hebrew to say in English, to say thank you, Stephen, for joining us. And I wanted to add that we find in these days that it's not easy to find someone that can relate to what's going on here, not in the way of understanding what we going through, because I think no one can understand if he's not here or cannot fully understand, but still to refer to what we're going in a way that will be meaningful for us. It's not easy. We've heard people from different places and doing their best. So for us, your previous talk was very touching, very meaningful. And thank you very much for coming again. And I also think I think I said it last time, I think it's quite brave on your side to join us in such difficult times. And just to say, I think it's 2 weeks from the previous talk, and I think in many ways we're still in the same place of shock and still waiting maybe for the grief to come. I know I'm still waiting to cry out all the hard and difficult emotions, and we're still in war. And my son is in Gaza. I'm sure many of the kids and the grandchildren of the people here are involved in the fighting. So it's a big part of our reality now. And I think another part of our reality is that things that happen now in Gaza are not easy. You know, it's something that's not easy to witness, and we have and we experience a lot of criticism from the world. So we've gone very quickly from being the victims to being the victimizers or the aggressors, and I think it really hurts people's hearts. You know, people take it very personally. So this is also part of our reality these days. And I would just mention one more thing, and then you'll take it to wherever you take it, and we'll follow you. But for me, there is, and I think for many people, there is one more aspect to this very, unique situation we're in, is that many of the horrible things that happened 6 weeks ago were filmed, and there are many videos of horrible things. And part of the thing that's going on here in these weeks is the question: how much do I need to expose myself? Does bearing witness include me having to see the horrible things personally in my eyes? If I can't see it, is it in a way me avoiding the reality, the harsh reality, or is it a skillful way of um, protecting my soul and others? So this is just one more aspect of what we're going through. And I'll just say to the people, if you want to ask a question, the best way will be if you write a question in the chat. We will call you one by one and to ask the question, so we can do it in an organized way. So after Steve starts talking, if you have a question, just write them. You can write them either in Hebrew or in English, and we'll call the people to ask the questions later. So thank you, Stephen, and we are with you. It's all yours now.
Okay. Thank you. We have a little bit of a delay, at least on my end. So hopefully, if I speak a bit slowly, more slowly than usual, maybe that's a benefit.
We hear you. We hear you very well. We don't get much of the delay. And I just didn't mention that Emma is translating you through the chat, so
Okay.
we will have a bit of translation going on in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, you can speak freely.
Okay. So I am on, in every way, the other side of the world from where most or all of you are sitting. I'm in Maui in Hawaii. I just finished touring with the Nights of Grief and Mystery, a project that we brought to Tel Aviv. Is it only 3 months ago? My God, or 4 months ago, something. And I'm just coming out of the arc of being extremely busy and talking way too much, and looking at the end of all my plans. They're basically finished. I have no idea what my life, excuse me, looks like even next week. And we're going home to the extreme cold very soon. And this conversation, this encounter we're having, marks basically the end of my working year and my understanding of what I'm here for. And I don't know what next year brings. There's a lot of changes on my end of things, and so I'm moved by the symbolic coming to an end, and I can't think of a more fitting place and time to do it and people to do it with than to acknowledge certain amount of endings in my own little life, and see what we can do here in the next hour or hour and 15 minutes to find some way to be useful. So with that in mind, first thing is a caveat, a sort of a cautionary observation, that I'm speaking in a language that's not the first language probably for most of you. It is my first language, and so I come to it easily. And some people say I have some skill with the language, which doesn't help people whose language is not English, at least they're not their first language. So if anything needs repeating or could use repeating, please don't hesitate to intervene, and somebody let me know that repetition would be beneficial. It's not a problem on my end at all. Secondly, I actually made a couple of notes, that a kind of sequence of overtures that might be useful in a different way from what we did when we spoke some weeks ago. And the reason I thought to do this is because I'm imagining, as is all I can do from here, what it means that another 3 weeks has gone by, and it's, I think, Boaz, you said it's 6 weeks, something in that neighborhood, since the early October. And my guess, my best guess on your behalf is that everything's worse. Now, generally speaking, people credit the passing of time with being its own kind of medicine. Maybe that's too strong. Its own kind of reassurance that as time goes by, certain things reestablish themselves, certain realities reinvent themselves or restate themselves, and a certain degree of the ability to have faith in the ordinary things of life seem to come back. That's, I think, what a lot of people count on with the passage of time, the notion that it somehow, if it doesn't cure things, at the very least, it makes them more livable. But I'm guessing that this is not true for you, for the lion's share of you now, and largely because nothing's over. So when I say things have gotten worse, I'm not really referring to the politics or the military politics of the circumstance. I'm referring to the notion that the passing of time has deepened, probably irredeemably, a certain kind of divisiveness that runs up and down your country, I'm imagining, and then vectors out from your country, as Boaz mentioned, and involves or invokes or seems to invite an extreme amount of opinionating from all sides, across the globe. And you've seen film, as have I, of street demonstrations that where people believe themselves to be on the high moral ground, and are attacking people they believe are not. So maybe I could begin with Boaz's observation, then I'll come to a few notes that I've made. What do I think about the notion that the availability of video film somehow creates a kind of moral obligation in everyone to expose themselves to it relentlessly and endlessly until what? Until the point is made. The point is made with the first contact, if not before then. I'm going to imagine out loud with you that exposure to those things does very little to open your heart beyond a certain point. I'm absolutely persuaded that the advent of this machinery, this unnatural miracle that is allowing us to speak back and forth, has an exceeding dark side to the whole enterprise. And the dark side is the notion that availability is the same thing as a mandate, that you have no choice in the matter, and that to choose to decide that you've seen enough constitutes some kind of cowardice on your part, or some kind of unwillingness to know things, and a desire to have the easier road and things of that kind. I think beyond a certain point, and I'm not sure what the point is, but surely to God there's a moment in the fire hose of information when you decide it's not information anymore. It's a kind of punitive torrent. This is regardless of the content. I'm talking about the sheer notion of availability. It's not actually available. It borders on the monstrous, the volume. And I'm not talking about the content. I'm talking about the difficulty we have in deciding if there's a moral limit to information for its own sake. And I'm suggesting to you that I don't think we're built as human beings to be forever being opened by what happens in places that we have no direct contact with and can't influence in any way at all, because it does open up the notion that you have a moral obligation to occupy a stance, which is why all this language of condemnation seems so current and so popular and so compelling now, that it's a direct consequence of all this information. And I'm imagining that the willingness to live with much less information volume-wise might actually enhance your capacity to engage the information that you are privy to with a full conscience, with a full heart. And those are slightly different things, I think, with a full mind and a willingness that is not constantly trying to find the bottom, a place to plant your feet. So a couple of items. I wonder, I've wondered this for many years, especially as the the arguments and the personality politics and the identity politics have arisen in my corner of the world. And this is not a stranger to you, what I'm describing to you. I wonder, what are we first? Not so much who are we first, but what are we first? Are we first human, and then everything else either serves that or fails it? Are we first racial humans? Is that our principle, the bedrock of our understanding of who we are is a racially derived understanding? Are we first gendered beings and then racial and then human? Are we cultured beings first and foremost, and all of those other attributes, gender and race and so on, fall in behind our culturedness? Are we first of all languaged beings, that all of our thinking derives from the language that we're entrusted with, and our failure to work very hard on the language has immense consequence all down the road for those other things? And depending on what we decide, and there's others on the list, that's what I came up with very quickly while I was waiting to get on the call with you. I'm wondering, which of these do we obey in a time of relative peace and calm? And does that change when a crisis comes upon us? And so I'd like to ruminate for a moment about the word crisis as it comes to mean what it means in the English language. And I'm guessing that there'd be a Hebrew equivalent to what I'm about to describe to you. But of course, you would know that better than I. So I'm here in Maui. And as some of you may know, not that long ago, at the beginning of August or so, there was a catastrophic fire that consumed a large portion of a small town close by here. I don't know how many, upwards of 1,000 or more people died in the fire, all in the space of 20 minutes or half an hour. And certain cultural and racial tensions that have been here since people who look like me came here have all burst into they have a new presence, let's say, and a new adamance about them. And they're very much related to fire and who died in the fire and on all these things. So I was here teaching for the last 3 days, and crisis, of course, led the way in terms of the contemplation. So here's something that you might find useful. The word crisis, in its etymology, in its old history, does not mean a horrible thing that never should have happened. It doesn't mean anything close to that. The word crisis is very closely related to the word cross. some kind of intersection. That's its first level of meaning. A crisis is a place that whereby things that in a prior circumstance lived a kind of parallel existence side by side for reasons that are specific to the circumstance. They find themselves changed in course and they cross over each other, not conflict, overlap. Yeah. And so the next thing to consider about things critical is that up until this moment, you nursed the idea that you had multiple options available to you. Modern people in particular love the notion that we have choice beyond belief, that that's what constitutes our freedom fundamentally, is our ability to choose from amongst consumer goods, ideological orientations, and everything in between. The advent of a crisis and the overlapping and the making of a crossroads means that the notion that you had many options begins to be winnowed. That's an agricultural term. It means many of them fall away. And you discover in the context of a crisis that you don't have as many choices as you once believed that you did. That you could panic because of that, or you could understand that the reduction of choices does tend to clarify things, sometimes unnaturally, sometimes deeply unfairly, but the clarity is there in a way that was never there in normal life when you thought the choices were legion, multiple. So there's a kind of unwelcome clarification, you could call it. Yeah, a startling, stark kind of clarification. The next element of a crisis is the obligation to choose now that the moment is at hand. And the fourth element is you are choosing, regardless of whether you understand this element of crisis or whether you don't. You remain as a human a choosing being. Next observation to make, I'm sure you have an observation that sounds very much like this, but rendered in English, we say, the enemy of your ancestor is also your ancestor. Which is, I should say that the video just changed, so I'm not looking at anything at the moment. It's a dark screen.
Yeah, there's a problem. I'll try to fix it.
Okay, all right. I'll keep going, yeah? Oh, there we are. So let me just say that again. So the enemy of your ancestor, also your ancestor. And this is an acknowledgement, not of affinity. This is an acknowledgement of history. And as soon as I talk about history, at some level, I have to talk about time, the meaning of the passing of time. And by definition, does history mean gone? So give me a moment and I'll see what I can do with that. I was taught in school, and perhaps you were too, that time, the movement of time is akin to the movement of a river or anything fluid. And that time, by definition, in any sane person's understanding, moves from the past through the present to the future. And I never heard anybody be troubled by that or wonder if it was true or seek an alternative understanding unless they were drug influenced, but in their usual state, not so much. And I ended up with a school called the Orphan Wisdom School, in which I imagined that this may not be accurate. And so I came with this understanding, see what you think. If we stand in a river, and the river is as deep as our knees, and we face the direction the river is flowing to, okay? We don't face its source, which we imagine to be behind us. We face its where it's going and where it's gone, in fact. And then I were to ask you, if you're standing in the river with me, what time are you facing? Not which direction on the compass, which time? The chances are good you'd say you're facing where everything's going, it must be the past. but everything is going, all the water is going past you in that direction. That means everything that's ever been on the shoreline and in that water is heading there if it's not there already. And at least in the English-speaking world, when we talk about where everything goes, we're not talking about the future. We're talking about the past. And there's no doubt in my mind that that image, if nothing else, is persuasive of the notion that time moves to the past. It does have a momentum, but that's what it is. Not to the gone, to the past. The past, in every sense of the term, is our future. Meaning that's where we're headed. We're headed towards, to join with everything that has been before us, whether you call that ancestry or reincarnation or notions I can't think of right now. So if everything heads to the past, then by definition, the past is awaiting us, and our participation in it is awaiting us. And that's what constitutes our future. Everything that has been before us, remarkably and strangely, is our future. So the title that that Boaz imagined for us here is, what is our allegiance, if you will? I shouldn't say our, your. What is your allegiance to your past in a time of crisis? Is this even a useful question to wonder about? Is that what living somewhere comes to? Is that what citizenship, and I don't really mean political citizenship now, I mean a kind of psychic, spiritual, soulful citizenship. Is it best understood as allegiance? As that you don't break step with what preceded you. You know, I was a student of Christianity for quite a long time. I went to divinity school and so on. And I have to, in case you haven't, wondered about Christianity lately, I'll do so on your behalf for a moment and say, it's a strange apparition, things Christian. That may not be news to you, I'm sure it isn't. But for those of us who grew up with it, it's strange to consider it strange. But here's its strangerhood. Christianity, in its beginnings, prided itself on being free from cultural affiliation, free from the very affinities and allegiances I just imagined out loud for you. In other words, it wasn't a specific linguistic reality, Christianity, nor a political reality, nor a geographic or a racial reality. And that's what allowed it to spread in the fashion that it did. And it's strangely, its failure to belong anywhere had the consequence of it belonging seemingly everywhere. I say seemingly because I don't agree that that's true, but historically, that's what happened. That the inability to belong was converted into an asset and made it available to all the world's downtrodden. And so far, that was the notion. It's not clear to me that not belonging to a place constitutes freedom. It seems to me that as human beings, our ability to belong somewhere is where our freedom is to be found. But very specifically by that word, I mean the freedom to be human, not the freedom from other humans. This is an immensely challenging proposition when you consider the real possibility, as you must have done in the last weeks, that it's possible to be, let's say, nominally a human being and act in ways that are demonstrably not humane. It's a quandary that has an immense moral implication for considerate, thinking, balanced, measured people who are deeply participating in the reality where they live.
Would you say that sentence again, please?
The very last one.
Yeah. The last difficult one. Yeah.
I'll try. Yeah. Okay, I'll come to it another way. So everyone's familiar with the word neurosis, who's listening, I'm sure. And you may have been called neurotic a time or two in your life, or called someone else that. So it's an important word to consider right now, I think, because the word neurosis has nothing to do with, quote, crazy per se. It's not an attitude. It's not a personality type. Neurosis very specifically means this: the presence of the past is so persuasive and so intrusive that the present becomes indistinguishable from it. That's what neurosis means, yeah? And so the question, I think, belongs in a time of crisis, like the time that you are in locally, and the time in some ways that many of people in the globe are in, sort of one step removed. And it might be this: how are you to exercise your responsibilities as a thinking, three-dimensional human being, possessed of a soul and the obligations that come with having a soul and a spirit? How are you to do so in the presence of a history that persuades you that being human is not always the best course of action, that engaging certain inhumane possibilities is so close to survival that you can't tell them apart? This, it seems to me, just in the realm of ideas, never mind trying to live it out every day, borders on a kind of catastrophic.
I slowed you down a bit, okay?
Slow down a bit. Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. One more element that I'll bring to it, hopefully slowly, goes like this. Again, my language, the English language, it gives us the verb to remember. Now, if you investigate the word at all, you discover that the verb to remember does not mean to be reminded. Being reminded is passive, but remembering is active. But if I quickly say to an English-speaking audience, what's the opposite of remember? They would almost uniformly say forget, as if these are the only two possibilities when it comes to that. But we have a synonym for remember. It's recollection, or to recall or to recollect. And that's the hint. The verb to remember actually means to gather back together again that which was once intact, and because of circumstances beyond someone's control, is no longer so, and broken and splintered and cast aside. So the act of remembering is literally gathering those broken things back together again. As Leonard Cohen said in one of his later songs, he begins the song by saying, and gather up the brokenness and bring it to me now. And the song's called Come Healing, I believe. So I would imagine then, with that kind of coincidence, that there's a relationship between memory and healing, which is fundamental to a living person, a conscious living person. But does memory, by definition, keep a wound open? What's it for, in other words? What is your memory of these very days to be for? How is it available to you? And what will it do to you 6 months and 6 years and 6 decades from now? There's a few other things, but maybe there's questions. Okay, last thing. It probably is not news to any of you that I worked in the death trade for quite a while, and I was obliged to understand what constitutes love and what constitutes grief in a circumstance where love and grief seem to be opposites, or where one is, it automatically banishes the other. And it's gonna sound like a bit of a formula, so my apologies for that. But this is what I came up with years ago. Excuse me, years ago. It's possible that you don't really hold anything dear until you see the end of what you hold dear. Until you see the end of what you claim to love, I'm guessing you may not be loving it really. What you may be loving is its presence, its enduringness, its unchangeability, its reliability, and so on. And these are fugitive qualities. I think we could all agree. So imagine then that the act of loving someone or a period of time or a political arrangement or a moment in the life of a country, to do so without seeing the end of the arrangement that you love probably isn't love. It's probably conditions. And so loving the end of what you hold dear might be holding it dear in a real grown-up and very unwelcome, but very real fashion. P.S. You know, there's no real military reality in the country that I live in. I mean, I live actually quite close to a military base, but there is no military reality of anything comparable to what you live day in and day out. And so I take a chance to make this observation now. And with this, I think it's best if we invite the questions that people might have, or the observations that they might have, or objections. And it's this. Clearly now the vision of the government of your country is that a military solution is mandatory. I don't know about that, but I do wonder if a military solution is possible, which is a different understanding of what's in front of you. Is a military, how about it another way? Is a military solution the prelude to some kind of healing? And if so, whose healing? Is there such a thing as military healing? Or is it not perhaps more likely that even the military needs to be healed in a critical, crisis-bound time? When you have mandatory participation in the military, it's exceedingly challenging to heal the military from the consequences of the work that it does, right? And yet, of course, when the military comes home, their consequences of what they've seen and done pervade the culture. And Boaz and I have talked about his experience with this very specifically. So he knows what I'm referring to. And, you know, I say this very much, again, as an outsider who has no interaction with things military where I live. But from this point of view, I'm wondering whether or not, you know, so many indigenous cultures, including where I live, they had a culture-bound practice when the men would come home from a military campaign. They were not allowed into the village. They had to undergo a sequence of ritual engagements, which were designed to do two things. One was to somehow restore their soul, the understanding being that engaging in that kind of action has a drastic and disastrous consequence for your soul, which is different from saying whether they should do it or not. But it's acknowledgement that they are doing it. And the culture is trying to take care of the military by not letting them come back home automatically, the assumption being that they don't have the capacity to occupy, quote, peacetime, given what they've seen and given what they've done. And the other purpose of the rituals was to in some way or other articulate the relationship between the military and the dead that they left behind, not just their own, but the people that they killed as a result of the activities. This is radioactive ground I'm suddenly standing on now. So just one more sentence about it, which is a historical observation about what some people have done to try to contend with catastrophe and crisis when it comes back home. Their understanding is having killed in the context of a military event binds you in a relationship of obligation to the people that dead person on the other side of the wall left behind. It's extremely complex. It's extremely culturally informed. But the notion is immensely redeeming, I suggest to you, and way premature for me to mention probably. But I'm going to just finish the thought now by suggesting to you, indigenous cultures in the world are not left behind by the kinds of things we're talking about now. They've been there too in their fashion, maybe not in their millions or in their hundreds of thousands, but spiritually they've been in the catastrophe of war. And one of the things they've done to contend with the catastrophe when it comes back home is to delay its entry into the village, for one, to modify the nature of its entry into the village, for two, and for three, to make sure that the dead that are consequence of the conflict are not deemed to be, the obligations are now open between the living and the dead, not completed. I'll stop there and ask whether or not anybody has anything they want to talk about in terms of anything I've said or anything you brought to this meeting.
So I'll just say again, מי שרוצה לשאול, מוזמן לכתוב בצ'אט, ואנחנו נזמין אתכם לפתוח מיקרופון. Maybe I'll just, until people will write the questions, I'll just ask or I don't know, comment on what you said about the soldiers, the warriors going to war and coming back. And I think one of the things we're dealing now is that the war was in the village. It's not that the warriors went. We are very familiar with the situation of our soldiers who are us going to the war and coming back. And that's something we deal with for as long as this country exists. But this time the war was amongst us and we all been in the battlefield. Or it feels like we've all been there. So there is not even this option of, it's already here. It's among us.
Boys, what do you think that does to the observation about how to in some way soothe the soul of the combatant prior to rejoining so-called normal life? I mean, that's why I said this is premature now, right? Because we're not in that time. You're not in the time I'm describing. But God willing, you will be. Or will you? Will there ever be a time that's after this?
Will there ever be a time that after this that we can do something with all our souls, all of us who have been there in the battlefield, in a way to make the passage between a wartime to back to whatever, to normal life or to a peacetime? Is that what you're asking?
It's a little subtler than that. I'm wondering about the merits of peace, whether or not there's so many consequences for a time like this that peace is not particularly valued or even trusted, never mind pursued.
Yeah. Honestly, I can't answer you now. I think one of the things we all wonder about is where do we stand in relation to peace? Peace was the one thing we were praying for some of us were trying to practice it and not just to wait for it. And I think we are wondering, actually, maybe we have to have a new understanding. What does peace mean? You know, and even wonder if we're capable of being peace or being in peace.
Yeah. You know, apropos of what you've said, while we're waiting for the questions to come, one more detail. You may be aware that the history between the dominant culture in North America and the indigenous people is a terrifying history. We're not taught about it in the schools very well, very accurately, or very honestly, but it is utterly terrifying when you investigate it with any rigor at all. And one of the things that's arisen in the last 8 or 10 years maximum is the notion of what they're calling truth and reconciliation, which may be a phrase that comes from South Africa. I'm not sure. But this is a highly esteemed goal, you know, and everybody uses the phrase. And I'd like to imagine, and you'll see why I'm mentioning this now, apropos of what you've just said. The notion of truth and reconciliation, let's leave aside the word truth for a minute, which is its own battleground. But the word reconciliation, which sounds like, who wouldn't want this to happen? And it's an easy thing to do once the truth is established and things of this kind. I'd suggest to you it's exceedingly difficult, certainly in the North American context, that we would ever get close to reconciliation. And here's why. The RE in the front of the word suggests that some kind of conciliation has already happened, and all we have to do is restore it. Mm-hmm. But in the case of our history, that never happened. There was never a moment when people who look like me sat down at the table with people who did not look like me as equals. That never happened. So the notion that you're going to restore a thing that never took place in the first place is premature and probably a broken understanding that will never work. We have to get to conciliation first before we'll ever get to reconciliation with the indigenous peoples in North America. You understand why I'm mentioning this now, because I'm in no sense am I aware of the details of the history of your country since 48, I believe, right? But it is for you to wonder whether or not that moment of conciliation ever occurred that allows the possibility of reconciliation or peace. In other words, does it begin given everything, or does it begin with some of the things that never happened in the first place?
I have more questions about this, but maybe we will allow a question. Maha or Jamal? You want? תנסי עכשיו? לא, זה נפתח ושוב נסגר?
Yes. Okay, thank you. I have the question. Stephen, first of all, I want to say that I just want to make a comment that I think sometimes it's unfair to ask somebody like you who's I would say guru, at least for me, in grief, because that grief, you work with grief with individuals, and here when we're looking at a collective, there are so many other dynamics happening, and some of them completely out of our control. World processes that sometimes are seen and sometimes we have to really dig hard to understand. So I just want to say thank you for doing this, because we need to find ways to understand it, even if there is no prior experience. You know, it's that we need to use whatever tools we have. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for for attempting to help us understand. I have a question because I wanted to use the tools, like when you were here in Neve Shalom in June, those very hot days, you said something, and I'm not going to say it very elegantly. You said that love is grief for what you might lose, and grief is loving what we have. And I really kind of hung on to that. So if I take that and try to apply it to our collective and to our ideology, and I'm like, you're stepped into some radiological like area right now. I am too right now, as I'm saying what I'm saying as a Palestinian. I see our attachment to nationalism, to a Jewish state, a Palestinian state, or any state in the world, because you can see these conflicts in Ukraine and Russia and all of that, that our idea, we are in love with it, like we are in love with it, grief for what we might lose, but we're not really grieving that it's dead. It's a dead idea. Really, it's a dead idea in the sense that it proves itself horrible if we choose to be human before everything else. So I'm just trying to use your tools to make some understanding of what's happening here. So if I'm asking you, can you say something about our attachment to these ideologies? It's like, isn't it like a dead person, a dying person? A person who's dying that we really think we should hang on to when they really should just die, and we should let them die and say goodbye. We have something else to live for here. Anyway, I just want to leave you with that question. Thank you.
Okay. Oh yeah, well, if I can answer this question to anyone's satisfaction, I should have employment at the United Nations at the very least. But it's a worthy thing to wonder about, and I'm glad you've done so. So let me begin with the quote that you attribute to me and just clarify it slightly. The idea goes like this. There is a relationship between love and grief that needs to be articulated. Because very often people understand that love is the antidote to grief, when actually what it is much more often than not is the occasion for grief, not the solution for it, the occasion for it, the exercise of it. And so to clarify that, what I said at the time, or hope I said at the time, went something closer to this. Grief is a kind of love that you have. I don't think anybody would be troubled by that notion. We would recognize it, most of us, and agree. Grief is a kind of love, but a specific kind, or it's a love for a specific something. And that would be the something, the something would be whoever, whatever is gone, or gone from view, gone from active engagement, no longer as available as it once was, or they once were, or he or she once were, that kind of thing. So I don't think that it's not a challenge to imagine that grief is a kind of love, but that's the appeal I'm making, and suggesting that love itself is not time off from grief. Love is a kind of grief when it's exercised deeply. Specifically, it's a grief for that which has not yet passed from view, but almost certainly will do so. Yeah. So they belong very close to each other, love and grief. Now, on the ideological front, I have to be honest with you. I find engagement with the ideologies to be the least likely place where either love or grief could prevail. I don't have ideological solutions to ideological problems. It's not because I ignore that. It's because I just have to leave. I don't know how to put this. You know, there's only so much you're capable of in a lifetime. And sorting out ideologies is not something I'm capable of. And it doesn't trouble me overly, nor do I understand that ideologies like over and over prevail. I know the evidence seems to suggest, no, that's exactly what they do. They prevail. But they, over the longer term time frame, as you have said in your question, it's not clear that they do actually. Where have all the great civilizations gone, all of which were ideologically bound? So, and is that likely to come with what we think are the permanent and foundational realities of our time, represented by places like the United Nations and the nation state and sovereignty and self-determination and the right to exist and all those kinds of things? It's exceedingly difficult place to engage without resurrecting all of the ideological realities in doing so, in order to talk about them and to invest them with a degree of God-given reality that it's not clear that they have. And yet the first objection any clever person would raise to what I'm saying is, okay, what would you put in its place? And I don't have the solution, you see, because grief is not a solution, nor is it a problem to solve. Grief is an act of love in a time that would convince you of its impotence. That's what it is. And if grief ever belonged to a time and a place, it belongs to the time and place that you're asking me about. So how do you practice grief in a circumstance that just wants to get fixed? Because grief's not a tool for fixing things. It's an understanding of life that you employ in the work that you're trying to do to rescue the human world from itself, I think. So the first order of business is to recognize that your sadness belongs. I don't know that it's clear that the nation state, whether it be Palestinian or Israeli or Canadian or anything else, is looked upon kindly by the other world. I don't know that that's true. Do I think these are temporary arrangements? Well, in my lifetime, they'll all be there still. But ultimately, yeah, probably so. Does that mean that they're faulty by definition? Well, of course they are. Is it the best that we can do? Clearly, I hope it's not the best we can do. I'm talking about the capacity to bear witness, not the capacity to be an architect to solutions. And bearing witness, as best as I can figure it out, is being willing to see things that break your heart and testify to the heartbrokenness. And, this is not a time for everything. This is a time that's not going to allow a lot of moderation and subtlety of understanding. So I was asked a remarkable question the last time we met, and I'll just resurrect it now. The question was, in a time such as this, the woman said, how can I possibly keep my heart open? I think that was the gist of the question. And I didn't know the answer as she was asking it to me. So instead of having an answer, I said this. I think the attempt to keep your heart open and failing to do so is what an open heart in a time of crisis actually looks like. Failing to keep your heart open and trying to do so is your heart open. And in a time like this, so segregated and so extreme, there is no reward for having an open heart. For the time being, it has to be its own reward, its own encouragement. When I was in this is the last part of the answer then. When I was working in the death trade those years ago, people weren't very good at being heartbroken. And there's no shock to that saying so, but they weren't. They understood their heartbrokenness to be a problem that they had to solve while they still had time. And the way most people solved their problem of heartbreak was to have a smaller heart. Less heart means less brokenness. That's the tragic algebra of that understanding. But a grief-born understanding means this. Heartbrokenness asks for heart. It doesn't consume your heart. It employs it. It engages it. It gives it real work to do. It gives it a legitimate presence on the scene in a way that party politics and national, election campaigns and the rest never do. They leave your heart alone. You know that. I know that too. So it's a very unsatisfying response to what you said. In the short term, it certainly is. And I'm sorry that it is. And yet I think the limitations of the answer for now belong to now. That we don't look too far ahead, that we don't imagine a kind of one-size-fits-all sweeping solution that just eliminates the nation state and all shall be well. I mean, things weren't well before the advent of the nation state in many ways. And as Leonard Cohen so gorgeously observed in the latter part of his life, he said, oh, and another thing, he said, you're not going to like what comes after America. I think he's right. He's still right. He's dead and he's right on that matter.
If anyone else wants to ask, you can either raise a hand or write it in the chat. I think you had some more points written down that you didn't have the time to mention yet. Maybe you want to bring one more?
Oh, I did, man. I started to sound like a teacher. That's enough of that.
מאיה רוצה לשאול.
Maya.
Hi. Hello. So first, it's really, I don't know, I don't have the word, but I'm really touched by your willingness to bear witness.
Thank you, man.
For us, really. I've overheard you saying many times this recipe for more, for feeling more.
Ah, yes.
But now some of the feelings are, we kind of talked about it 2 weeks ago. Some of the feelings are revenge, hatred, real rage. And I wonder if you have any, and I know you are not a how-to guy or what to do with it guy, but do you know any ceremonial advices for something to do with these feelings? Because it doesn't have to do with love. So I don't know if it's grieving. It's something else.
Right. So specifically what you're wondering about is what becomes, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, if there is any ceremony to, I don't know, dispel those feelings somehow, because, practice letting go, it's not very easy.
No.
on an individual scale, or in a national scale, obviously.
I'm not sure that the national scale is the place to wonder about these things. I don't think that you can really orchestrate what you might call a national ceremonial grief event that somehow automatically or inevitably binds people to a shared understanding. Vengeance does that much easier than grief does. Sorry, I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see you better. Yeah. Vengeance is the ceremony now, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, so it's really important that we not imagine that a ceremony is free of all the things we're talking about. We've seen national ceremonies over the last 100 years that are predicated on grievance, right? And racial, well, I won't even go into it. You understand what I'm referring to. So the notion that we could orchestrate something that the populace will be content with letting it be grief and not operationalizing it into vengeance is very naive, I think, and probably dangerous. So you might have to imagine that ceremonies of vengeance and hatred, they're national one-size-fits-all solutions. But the little ceremonies of sorrow and heartbrokenness and the willingness to engage anger and hatred and vengeance and all of that without responding in kind, those, I think by definition, the scale of those things is very small. And so you might imagine that you're not going to be able to fix most people at any given time, or even offer them an alternative understanding to vengeance. Of course, vengeance fundamentally is not an understanding. It's what you do instead of the deeply inconvenient work of trying to understand. And, you know, I was about to say, listen, I won't say that, but consider this if you would. Understanding in a time like this only seems impotent, only seems childish and besides the point and totally incapable of responding to the scale of the transgression. But there's a seduction in the scale of transgression, isn't there? We all know there is. And that's why I said what I said to Boaz off the top about information. The more information you get, the more video stuff you see from the back of a motorcycle, day after day after night, imagining that that's what conscience asks you to do, has a consequence for your conscience. I think it makes your conscience a one-note symphony. And you're obliged to pick sides when your conscience is bedeviled by that kind of ongoing onslaught of information. You're obliged to choose sides in order to register at all as a person with a conscience, right? But I don't think a conscience operates at that scale. And this is why people in politics seem to change their position so easily, because their conscience is not really part of the dynamic. It's an awful thing to say, but it looks from the outside to be true. And so the work of reconciliation is microscopic in comparison to the truth, the facts that you see from the back of the motorcycle in the film footage. I know that. And probably somewhere in there, and I'm no expert on this or anything, but certainly not this, somewhere in there, we have to try again to remember or to consider that there's a difference between feeling that you're doing the right thing and doing the right thing. Sometimes you don't get to feel the affirmation, certainly not ahead of time, certainly not before doing the work, maybe after the work, almost never before. Whereas people who are deeply invested in vengeance, they get all of their satisfaction just by feeling the feelings of vengeance. They don't need to work at that. The work is already done for them by the packaged understandings and the packaged, film footage and all of that. So you're very much in a minority position across the board, I think, when you're willing for heartbreak to have its moment and not translate it prematurely into a resolving, powerful presence that will automatically undo things in some kind of biblically proportioned reality shift. These things are very small. And the truth takes time, it seems. It doesn't happen. And it's not patience that I'm talking about. It's a willingness to be heartbroken and understand that it's not the opposite of action. Heartbrokenness engaged in the public sphere is direct action on a closed heart. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Can you say the last sentence again?
The willingness to be heartbroken is not impotent, although God knows it feels that way at the time. But in a moment of extremism, a broken heart is direct action visited upon closed-heartedness, the vengeance mind, those kinds of things. The Dalai Lama said all this stuff better than me, but that's what I have.
Thank you. Itai has a question.
Hey, Stephen. I really appreciate your words, and thank you for being here. You're really touching my heart. And it's a bit related to what you said about that being open heart doesn't take patience. It takes being heartbroken over and over again. And
Correct.
my question is to you, I know that you also work with young people, especially. How do you encourage people, and how do you even empower people to be with an open heart, even though it has no reward and maybe even it has a price? How do you still encourage people to be this way so we can, instead of acting upon vengeance, for example, we can maybe do something else? I would love to hear your take on it, and thank you again.
Thank you too. Okay, the first thing I'm going to say is very, excuse the expression, shit disturbing. Okay, yeah. I would say don't accept anybody's warning about vengeance. Not mine, not anyone's. Okay, the notion that you should stay away from vengeance at all costs is a crazy proposition. So you could consider this instead. Experiment with vengeance. See if it's as satisfying as the salesmen say it is. Find out for yourself in a, let's call it a controlled way. Find someone to blame and blame them. And then observe yourself in the act of being satisfied, if that's what happens, or relieved, if that's what happens, or close-hearted, which is almost surely what will happen, as you defend yourself against the consequences of your vengeance, which almost certainly you will do in the short term. Yeah? So this is a very iffy proposition, what I'm describing now. But it's not like people aren't doing it all the time. I'm just saying, maybe do it deliberately then. Don't take a vow against vengeance. Find out how vengeance actually works, what the real mechanics are, what the real satisfaction is, what the real cerebral serotonin payoff actually is. And then you begin to realize, among other things, why is it so satisfying in the short term, but never in the long term? And I think one of the answers is because it wears off so quickly. And it's like a drug. You actually need more of it the second time to achieve the same level of satisfaction. And the third time, still more. And then you're beginning to realize, man, the way this vengeance things works is it requires you to keep going. There is no salvific aspect to vengeance. Its entire purpose is to reanimate itself and not go anywhere and not give in to anything and not go away. So there's the first proposition. The second one, how do I encourage people? I think you asked, or the answer
encourage or empower people.
Yeah,
to be open-hearted.
I don't think I do. There's lots of other people that are doing that kind of work. Great for them. I don't. The notion of empowerment. You and I both know that this word enjoys tremendous purchase. Really, across every time the word gets mentioned, most people go, yeah. I'm not one of those people. Here's why. The last time I checked, power doesn't seem to be very good for people. We don't seem to be very well tuned to the skillful employment of power. It tends to overwhelm even in small doses. Yes, something like vengeance, no? So I, for one, am not committed to the notion of empowerment, right? I'm not talking about impotence as an alternative. I'm talking about a kind of almost Gandhi-esque willingness to call into serious disrepute the forces of the times, to stand in ones and twos and 20s and hundreds and whatever it is, and it comes and goes. But as he did with the British, you know, he simply stood there. Skinny guy, not many clothes, no protection, right? With salt. Or there's other stories too. And it's not just him. And it's not the only way. And there is no such thing as the only way. But, you know, there are times when encouragement is a kind of lie, it seems to me. There are times when the heart, that's the root word of encouragement, by the way, right? The word heart, or cœur in French, that's the root word for encouragement. There are times when the heart can't continue. That's real. So I learned this when I was working with dying people. There's a time when you stop encouraging them to live, because now it's cruel to do so, right? They need the skillfulness of learning how to stop, not learning how to continue at all costs. The heart's the same way. You know, the conscience is the same way. There are times when the conscience is overwhelmed by the actions of other people. It's not permanent, but it certainly belongs. It certainly challenges your understanding of what human actually means. That's true. And then the next question that really troubles you is, how did their inhuman response to me begin? Where does it come from? What are its causes? What's the history to the cause? And now the ability to feel singularly vengeful begins to be compromised by what? By the three-dimensionality of the person you feel vengeful against. And I'm really, you know, I pray that considering your enemy to be a three-dimensional human being does not put you in harm's way. And I acknowledge fully that that is a possibility. And it's a tremendous and terrible risk. And it's one thing to risk it for yourself. It's another thing to risk it on the behalf of your family and your friends and so on. All these things are heartbreakingly true, aren't they? They are. We know they are. Okay. So then we're talking about something like a kind of crazy, courageous wisdom that's very hard to recognize in the moment. But it has the capacity to last longer than the vengeance it's dealing with lasts. And sometimes you have to play the longer hand. And you know, I may have said this last time. If not, I'll say it now. I believe one of the things that's happening now, not just in your country, but in other places too, is the awareness of what's happening is literally stealing a generation's ability to proceed otherwise in the world in the time to come. That is one of the great tragedies of now, is that how much a generation is likely to be taken up into a kind of renewed national mythology that's basically survivalist and it's impossible to set aside vengeance in the short term. Yeah. So this is a tragedy unto itself, right? That you see the capacity for a given generation to mobilize itself on behalf of a different kind of future is deeply compromised right now by what's going on, not by the official government. That's not the stuff I'm talking about. It's the casual stuff on the street. It's the casual things that get said. It's the unguardedness of the language. It's referring to them, for example, where they become two-dimensional and much easier to hate, right? That's the trouble with three-dimensional humanity. It's much harder to hate because it compromises your single-mindedness on that thing, right? And I just want to say, finally, the last part of the answer to the question is, I think I'm aware that what I'm saying could be understood as a recipe for just all of this happening one more time, because the vigilance is not there, and the safeguards are relaxed, and the hatred is disqualified. I don't think I'm disqualifying anything, honestly. I'm qualifying it. What does that mean? I'm trying to give it its context and its place, right? Because surely it belongs. What we're wondering is, should it prevail? But it definitely belongs. The vengeance belongs. If it didn't belong, you'd be a stranger to it, and so would I. And then we'd be so easily overwhelmed by people who don't find it strange at all, who find it natural and inevitable and proper to be vengeful. It's certainly understandable to be vengeful. It is deeply understandable. And on many levels, it makes a tremendous and tragic amount of sense. It really does. And this is not a time for that. This is a time for reading the page from the book of revenge, so that you understand it too. So that should the time pass when this is not the front page news anymore, you don't lose track of it. And you understand how precious the ability to be peaceful is, because you remember how natural vengeance was.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Steve, let me just check with you about time. I'm sure
Yes.
you have a long day ahead of you. We have one more question. Do you have time for one more?
Yes, sir, I do.
You do. Ronnie, do you want to ask? לא, לא שומעים אותך, את מושתקת. כן, הופ, לא, נפתח לרגע ושוב נסגר. לא, עדיין לא שומעים. נפתח ונסגר. עדיין אנחנו לא שומעים, רוני. רוני זה עדיין סגור.
עכשיו?
עכשיו.
Okay, I didn't give up because I want this to be heard. A lot of people, among them myself, didn't feel any, anything to do with revenge or even anger or hate. No, but the suffering is so huge that we live in a place where there's so much now sorrow here and in Gaza as well. And also the soldiers, that we have like a saying that they shoot and cry. I mean, some of them, or they will cry afterwards, but the thing is that I attended this evening because I was hoping to get some, some wise highlight about how to contain all the suffering that we experience, and bothering thought that it's kind of a destiny that if we choose to live, we are in the crying game. We're in the blood game. We have to fight, and it's a bit desperating or confusing. So these are the things, the great sorrow all around. It's very hard to contain.
Yeah. I don't think you will be able to contain it, not personally, and not culturally, not nationally. I don't think this is going to help in any way at all, at least not today, and maybe not ever, but I'll try. Everything is not available all the time at any given moment. All the solutions, all the wisdoms, all the capacity to love, forget, all the capacity for vengeance and retribution, all the capacities for sorrow, and on, they're not all here now. I think it's desperately important. The reason I began with talking about the word crisis is to try to give you a feel for the notion that there are times and places for the human soul in concert with other human souls, where not everything can happen. Not everything's there. And our time is marked by that understanding. And this is why is it Ecclesiastes, I think? To everything there's a season, that notion. This is what I think the wisdom of that piece of the Bible is. It's saying, look, there are times you should not reap. It's too early. There are times when you can't sow because nothing will grow. It's too cold. And there's wisdom in understanding. This is not the time for everything. You can think alternative thoughts to what's prevailing in the times, but you're not going to contain the sorrow that you're describing. And maybe, or I'll say it differently. What is the mark of a sane society? It may not surprise you that I have an answer. It's not the answer, but it's one. A sane society is not a place where there's no crazy people. A sane society has a lot of crazy people. But a real sane society is a place where not everybody's crazy at the same time. And people realize there's a time for craziness, and it afflicts my neighbor right now, but not me. So that's cause for gratitude as well as for action. You realize this is not your time to be crazy, but clearly their time. Okay, so a sane society has the capacity to include its craziness, not to exercise the craziness as if it doesn't belong to sane people. It does belong to sane people. And sane people's job in a crazy time is to do everything they can to care for the crazy people. Now, of course, I'm using this term, heavy quotation marks, and there's a lot of things that has to be said about what do you mean by sane and what do you mean by crazy. But I think one of the things I'm referring to is the kind of collective understanding that vengeance is the only sane response to an insane, inhumane intervention. It's understandable, but you do have to, at some point, wonder, when does the craziness of the response end? Does it have a lifetime after which it should not prevail? And the answer is not very easily. It doesn't give up. Like most living things, the instinct for payback or retribution is sure of itself. It doesn't wonder about itself at all, right? So the feel I'm trying to give you here is that the wisdom of a culture is not really found when the culture is operating successfully and easily and peacefully and in a prosperous way. The real measure of a culture is its capacity to remain cultured in a moment when everything seduces it away from its culturedness. I don't really mean its habits. I mean the deep well that the culture comes from. And maybe that's the antidote to the question earlier about the nation state. The antidote to a nation state is culture, not we're all the same. We're not all the same. And it looks like that's a sort of God-given fact of human life. So how do we not be the same together becomes the question, but not prematurely. This talk of togetherness right now, it seems to me in your country is desperately and criminally premature. And so there's a time, there's a season now that's taking away a lot of possibilities. And the wise people among you will ride this thing, not stand in front of it like it's a train coming at you. Step aside, understanding you will not stop it anytime soon. But you offer people an incarnation of what wisdom minus vengeance looks like. Not minus vengeance, wisdom that is considered vengeance and considered its cost. And you know, you can't argue wisdom, right? And wisdom tends not to argue. Wisdom tends to tell stories instead, it seems. And at the end of the day, that's what most of us have, is the stories we were entrusted with, right? And this, so you got to imagine then, as I used to say to dying people all the time, please proceed as if you finally realize that you are making the memories now that people will have in the time to come of these days. Sometimes you are in the memory-making business, and a crisis is one of those times. Then you realize, man, that's a responsibility that has flex in it. It does. It's not another belief system. It's the antidote to the belief systems. You're making the memories that people will have in the time to come. What would you want them to remember most? What would you want them to be visited by in the midnight hour? Please proceed accordingly. And that's what I tried to do here for an hour and a half, you know, is I don't know. I don't know more than you do about these things, you know. I'm riding the wind best as I can figure out, and then you're wrong more often than you're not. But you know, the old adage, I think it was Winston Churchill said, I'm often obliged to eat my words, and I find the diet particularly nourishing sometimes. So I'll probably eat some of these words here now. But if I could leave you with anything, because I know we're at the end of the time that we've agreed to, it would be this. There's no way to sum up these things, no? Because in 10 minutes time, we're all returning to the life we quietly set aside for a little while. I'll do that here, you'll do that where you are. So we had this strange, unnatural miracle of a little bit of time out from the craziness to wonder about the craziness, but to try to do it in a way that wasn't crazy too. And sometimes you have to find a way to be satisfied with those small interventions. And you don't get a chance to see, you know, it's the old Moses thing, right? You stand there, you're looking across the river, and you won't get to the other side. That turns out not to be your part of the story. You get to anticipate people crossing over, but you're not one of them. Like Martin Luther King, you know, that's what he said to the American people, but then the Black people in the States. I may not be there with you, he says, but he knew he wasn't going to make it because they were after him. So in some fashion or other, you know, our humility asks us to recognize there's a lot of limits. Our imagination is not very limited, but our capacity to act on it is. So it's a wonderful reassurance that you're not likely to have cosmic consequence. And I think that's enormously helpful in a strange sort of way. The problems seem cosmic, but your response to them is quite small by comparison. So the good news is you're not likely to make cosmic mistakes, just little ordinary human mistakes that you can learn from, that you don't have to clean up after too badly. So you can hear that's the appeal I'm making, as a human scaled response to inhumanely scaled consequence that's afoot right now.
Okay. So thank you. I'm tempted. I have so many more questions and things I would like you to talk about. So maybe we should already leave you with a request to come back when you can. I want to say thank you for everybody for coming. Thank you for Emma for translating both here and doing the subtitles for the previous talk. That was immense work. Thank you so much, Emma, for that. And yeah, I think everybody who talked expressed their appreciation for you for joining us at this time. You know, I thought of you say when you go to a funeral of somebody, of a loved one, and there's so many people, so much confusion, but somehow you tend to remember the people who've been there with you at that time. And I think we are remembering now people who've been with us in this time. So thank you for remembering with us.
Amen.
And have a safe travel back home. You have a long way still.
I do.
Some way. We see you again. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody. Maybe we can open the mics for everyone to say.
Well, I opened.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You're the best.
For your kind
God
words.
bless you.
with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Into your little skeleton behind you.
I know.
Thank you very, very much. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen. Also, thank you, Emma, for the translation.
Amen.
See you, I hope.
I hope so too.
עכשיו, יכול להיות שהיו יותר, כי זה היה מדהים.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Take care.